So we are interviewing Jeanette Buchwald in Beechwood, Ohio on November 30th, 2023.
Jeanette, thank you for being here today. We very much appreciate it. What is your name?
Jeanette Buchwald.
What was your name at birth?
Yaja Auerbach.
Could you spell that, please?
Yadzia. And Auerbach is Auerbach.
Thank you. Where were you born?
Lodz, Poland.
And when were you born?
April 1936.
And how old are you today?
87.
And
I have.
What is your father's name?
Sam Auerbach.
And where was he born?
He was born in Posomno, Poland.
Could you spell that, please?
No, I really don't know how to spell it.
Okay.
It was a small town. S-O-M, some P-O-L-N-O.
And when was he born there?
He was born in 1907, October 21st, in 1907.
Okay, thank you. How close was that town? What was the closest major city to that town then?
I think it was Lodz.
Okay.
I think it was pretty close.
Who were his parents?
His parents were Rivka and Yitzchak Auerbach.
Do you know when they were born?
No idea. All I know is that his father was a rabbi.
You know his father's name?
Yeah, Yitzchak Auerbach.
Okay. And your mother, what is her name?
Her name is Sylvia Auerbach.
What was her name at birth?
Cyril or Tsesha Verdiger.
Can you spell that?
Werdger.
Do you know when she was born?
1912.
And her parents' names?
Moshe Verdiger and Yentl Verdiger.
And did your parents have any children in addition to you?
Not before me.
Okay.
They had one after the war.
Okay, and how many siblings?
How are they? I'm sorry.
How many siblings?
Oh, I have one brother.
Okay, what is his name?
Irving Auerbach.
And where was he born?
He was born in Landsberg, Germany. Well, actually, the hospital was in Munich, which is a bigger city than Landsberg. We lived in Landsberg, but the hospital was in Munich.
Do you know the name of the Munich hospital?
No.
Okay. So, did you grow up in the same town that you were born in?
Till I was 3, yes.
Okay. And what languages were spoken at your home?
Mostly Polish. My parents did speak some Yiddish when they didn't want me to know what they were talking about.
Were they successful in that?
Well, eventually I learned how to understand them. But I was much older by the time I caught on to it.
And when you caught on, did they then change to another language when they didn't want you to understand what they were saying?
I don't know if they realized that I understood. I never let them know that I understood. So they know. They spoke mostly Polish at home.
Okay. Could you describe the home you lived in until the age of 3?
Well, we had a nice apartment. My dad had a business at home. He had a wholesale business of yard goods. And I assumed there was an extra room for that. We had a kitchen. We had a maid, a girl from a farm, a young girl, that slept in the kitchen. And my mother did not work. And we had a very comfortable life.
What part of town, how would you describe the part of town that your childhood home was in?
Well, I think we lived on the main street, which was supposed to be a good thing. And I think we were on the 3rd or 2nd floor of the apartment building. The 3rd floor.
Okay. And you and your parents were Jewish?
Yes, definitely we were Jewish.
How would you describe their observance of Judaism when you were growing up?
Well, I don't remember when I was 3, but I assumed that since one of my grandfathers was a rabbi and the other one was a very religious man, I assumed they had a very kosher home. However, they were very modern. My dad did not have a beard like my grandparents did. He was dressed in very, very modern outfits. My mother used to love to go dancing, and which she usually did with one of her brothers, who also liked to dance. And it seemed like they had an afternoon session where they could go and do ballroom dancing.
Did you go with them at any time?
Not at the age of 3, no.
Okay. Did you spend a lot of time with your grandparents?
I really don't remember. And one set, I only had a grandmother, and she lived in São Paulo. And the other one, I had a grandfather who lived in Lodz. And I think my mother did spend a lot of time with her father, and I was included. But at that age, I just don't remember.
Okay. When did you and your family move to Lodz?
From Lodz?
To Lodz.
Oh, I think they lived there. Well, my dad lived in São Paulo. And when his father passed away, at the age of 13, he decided he needed to go to a big city where he could work and make some money and send to his widowed mother, who had 3 other children at home. And he was the oldest son, so at the age of 13, he came to Lodz. He lived with an uncle, an aunt, and he went to work in a warehouse, I think, and he sent money to his mother to help her out.
And do you know how your parents met?
Well, they said that there was a lot of, in the evening, there was a lot of walking in the streets. It's called the Deptak, where they just took little walks, and he saw her at one time. And somehow one of his grandmothers and one of her grandmothers knew each other. And somehow through them, he was able to manage to meet her and get engaged.
You know anything about how long their courtship was?
I think about a year.
You know when they were married before you were born?
Oh, I think they were married about a year or two before I was born. But I really don't know the year. I know their anniversary we always celebrated was in December.
Okay, so you were born in Lodge?
Yes.
Okay, I had understood that you were born in a small town outside of Lodge.
No.
My mistake.
No, my dad was born there. No, my mother lived always in Lodge, and I was born in Lodge, in a hospital.
Okay. Do you know the name of the hospital?
No.
Okay. And then at the age of 3, you've referred to it several times. Something changed. Was that the beginning of the war?
Well, it was, I believe, September 1st, 1939, that Germany invaded Poland, and things changed.
And how did your parents respond to that?
Well, my dad, who heard over the radio that all young men who had a white card, who were not in the service, were obligated to go to Warsaw and protect Warsaw. So he left for Warsaw because he had one of those white cards. He was never in the service, but he was a young man at the time, and he went, as he was told, to protect Warsaw. However, when he got there, the bombs were coming down. There was such a terrible situation that he never found the Polish army to join. And somehow he was captured and put on a train, and with some other, with another group, with a large group of other men, and they assumed they were being taken to a labor camp. However, when they passed a small town that my dad was familiar with, he suggested that maybe they better jump. So as the train slowed down going through the town, he and a bunch of other men jumped from the train. They were being shot at. Luckily, my dad was not hit. So once he ran away and started going home. I think it took him about a week because there was no transportation. It was mostly by foot that he went home. On the way, he said he did meet somebody, a rabbi or somebody that he knew was Jewish, and he told them things are very, very bad, that in this one town, the Germans took a bunch of Jews, religious Jews, made them cut off their beards, put on their talit, and hung them in the square. And when my dad heard that, he rushed as fast as he could to get home to see how the situation was at home. When he did get home, I think it took him about a week to get home. When he got home, my mother didn't even recognize him. Of course, all this time, he never changed clothes or bathed, or I don't know where he was able to get some food. But she just didn't even recognize him.
When your father went to Warsaw in September of 1939, was he captured there by German military forces?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And while he was in Warsaw, before he was encountering any anti-Semitism?
I really don't know.
Okay. Did either of your parents talk about encountering anti-Semitism before World War II started?
Not that I recall. No.
Did they ever encourage you from, or discourage you from playing with any non-Jewish children?
No, not at 3.
Okay. And so...
But the only friends that I had, I assume, were my parents' friends who had children my age.
When your father escaped from this train after being captured, you said it took him approximately a week to make his way back to Lodz. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you hear any of the conversations that your father and mother had once he returned home?
No, I didn't hear any. But from what I understand, things were so bad in Lodz that my dad decided that there was no way they could stay there, that they would have to leave Lodz.
So they went from Lodz to where?
Well, Poland was divided in 2. Russia and Germany were allies at the time, so Germany took half of Poland and Russia took the other half. And he heard that things on the Russian side were much better, at least for the Jews, because in Lodz, the Jews, first of all, they had to wear the star. They had to be identified. They had a curfew. They were not allowed to have any businesses. And interestingly enough, my dad had a German customer that he knew very well. And he had told him that things are going to get very bad for the Jews. And that's when my dad decided, no way is he staying in Lodz. So what he did was he was able to hire a guide with a truck, and he and my mother's 2 brothers and my mother's younger sister's fiancé decided to leave Lodz and go to the Russian side. They smuggled over there, and when they got there, my dad said he found a little apartment for us, and he sent one of the brothers, the older brother, he sent back to Lodz to get us. And when he arrived, my grandfather told my mother that he He really didn't want us to leave, but he made her promise that she would not stay in Russia and she would not take Russian citizenship, because once you do that, you can't come back to Poland, that she would return after the war and come home. So he was able, my uncle was able to hire the custodian's son with a truck, and he took my mother and her younger sister and me to the border where Russia and Germany divided. And I remember that crossing that border, we had to do it going through a forest at night. And I remember being on my uncle's shoulders and told to be very, very quiet. He said, if we get caught, they could shoot us or they could send us back. Anyway, I really was scared, but we crossed safely the border and we got to a place where my dad had an apartment for us, a little room. It was in Pinsk. Pinsk was on the Russian side of Poland.
Now, did this all take place in October of 1939?
Probably October or November. Mm-hmm.
In November, did you say?
Either October or November.
Ah, okay.
I don't know how long it took my dad to get over there and send back my uncle to pick us up. I don't know how long it took him.
Okay, and what are the names of your mother's two brothers and her sister?
Her sister was Anna, and her younger brother was Meyer, and her older brother was Burach, and Burach was the one that came to pick us up.
And how did Burach spell his first name?
Burach.
And was Burach the uncle whose shoulders you rode on at night?
Yes.
Okay. Now, while you and your mother and the rest of your family were waiting for your father to return to Lodz, do you remember what your mother and you did while waiting?
No, I don't remember. But what my mother tells me is that every time there was a siren, we had to run down the 3 flights of stairs into the basement while they were bombarding or throwing bombs or whatever. It was war. There was very little food. And she said a couple of times, the farmer girl who used to work for us would come over and bring us a little basket with some food. But I really don't remember anything but just what my mother was telling me.
Do you remember how you felt while all these things were going on?
I probably was scared. I really don't remember. I blocked it out. I think I blocked out most of it out of my memory.
Do you remember your mother or your aunt or uncles comforting you during this time?
Oh, I'm sure. It was very comforting to have them. I was very lucky to have my mother, my uncle, my aunt with me.
And the farm girl who worked for your parents, who also accompanied you during part of this time, do you remember her name?
Yanka.
How is that spelled?
Yanka. Yanka.
Did you know her last name?
No,
Okay. Was she Jewish or
no,
non-Jewish?
no, she was not Jewish. That's why she was able to come in and out. Jews were not really able to travel or move around on the streets very safely with their yellow stars. But being a Gentile, she had no problem. And she was devoted enough to come and bring us some food.
And did she accompany you during part of the time your family moved from Lodz? And I heard you say Pinsk, not Minsk. Was she
Pinsk.
with you part of that time?
Oh, no, no. As soon as the war broke out, she went home. She didn't work for us anymore. No, as soon as the Germans came in, she left. She went home.
Do you remember anything more about the escape from Lodz to Pinsk or Minsk?
No.
And
No, I made a
where-
mistake about Pinsk. No, it was Minsk.
It was
I mean,
Minsk.
Pinsk.
misunderstood.
It was Pinsk that we went to.
Okay, not Minsk.
No.
The old comedy routine. Okay. So once your family arrived in Pinsk, where did they live? You said your father found a place for you and your family to live. Where was that?
In a building, a room in a building. And I don't really know.
Do you remember how many people lived in that room with you and your family?
I assume it was my aunt and her two brothers.
Were any of those three, your aunt or two uncles, were any of them married at the time?
No. None of them were married at the time. However, soon the two young men did find ladies that were from Pinsk. And before we left, they did get married and they remained in Pinsk.
And so how long was your family in Pinsk?
Oh, I don't think it was very long. I really don't know. I think it was June that we left Pinsk. Yeah.
June of 1940?
1940, right, June 1940.
Let me ask you just to go back for a moment. When your family escaped from Lodz to Pinsk, how many days did that take?
Oh, I wouldn't know.
During that crossing, do you remember, did you go through a town? Did you go through a forest? Did you go through, because you traveled at night, you said.
Yes.
So did you know what area you were moving through
No.
during that change?
No, I didn't, but we did have a guide. And if you paid, you were taken where you wanted to go. All you needed was some money.
You know the name of that guide?
No.
Did your parents ever talk about that guide after
No.
you arrived in Pinsk?
No.
But the guide was paid by your parents
Yes.
to take you?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anything more about him? Young man, older man, Jewish, non-Jewish?
Oh, non-Jewish. Oh, yeah.
Do you know anything more about him?
No, just that it was a young man, the janitor's son, so he must have been a young man, and he was not Jewish.
Ben, is there any way to boost audio levels
For her, to you?
for Jeanette?
The microphone is connected into the camera, but not into the laptop, and there's no way to do that.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. Well, this will be edited out, so don't worry, Jeanette. So once you and your parents and two uncles and aunt arrived in Pinsk, how long were you there?
Well, we must have been there till June, actually the end of June, because we left on the 29th of June, 1940, is when we were taken out of Pinsk.
When you were taken out of, I couldn't hear that.
Yes. You can't hear me?
When you said when we were taken out of, but I couldn't hear the rest.
Yes, we were considered prisoners of war because we would not take Russian citizenship. The government offered us those, and we refused to take them. My dad said no, he's got to go back because he has an old mother on the other side, and he would like to bring her back. And they said, well, if you're not with us, you're against us. So you are prisoners of war, and you're enemies of the state. And they told us one night, this was the 29th of June, in the middle of the night at 2:30 in the morning, they knocked. Two gendarmes came to our door. They knocked on our door. They said, you have 2 hours to pack because you're leaving. And after the 2 hours, no, they gave us a half an hour to pack. What am I saying? They gave us a half an hour to pack because you're leaving. So my mother quickly made a couple of sandwiches because we didn't know how long we'll be traveling. And they took us downstairs where there were a lot of horse and buggies, and the street was full of them because we were not the only Polish citizens that refused to take Russian citizenship. So there was a whole street full of buggies with horses pulling them, and we got in with all our belongings, and we were taken to the train station. And at the train station, we were packed into a wagon, 40 people into one wagon. The doors were locked, and the train took off.
Let
And
me ask, was it the Russians
oh, yes,
declared you prisoners of war?
yes. They said we
So-
were
Go ahead, please.
enemies of Russia. So we were going to be shipped. We assumed we were being shipped back. However, after a while, there was a little window in one of these cattle cars with 40 people in there. And there was a little window. And the next morning, somebody looked out the window and they said, the sun is in the wrong place. We're not going west back to Poland. We're going east. We didn't know where we were going. But we spent a week in that wagon. Not everybody made it. Every evening they stopped and let a couple of people out to go and bring some watery soup. And once a day they would throw a couple of breads into the wagon. So there wasn't much food. And for a week we were in that wagon traveling east. We had no idea where we were going.
You know how many cattle cars there were in this train?
It was a long train, but no, I really don't know. All I know is that there were about 40 people in the in the in the train. There were about 4 shelves. So people had to take turns laying down on the shelves. And sometimes there wasn't even a place to sit down. It was so
I
crowded.
heard you. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's it. It-
You said that once a day, 2 people were let out of the train to find bread and soup, and that sometimes bread was thrown into your cattle car. What about drinking water? Was there any drinking water provided?
Yeah, once a day when they went down, they would bring back water with them.
And do you know how the food and water was divided among the 40 people in your cattle car?
No. My mother did have a couple of sandwiches, which lasted us the first 2 days. But that's about it.
You said not everyone in your cattle car survived the journey. Is that right?
That's right. I understand some people didn't make it.
And what happened to those people's bodies?
I imagine they were thrown out. I really don't know.
How were bathroom needs addressed?
Well, there was a little hole. There was a little hole in the floor of the train, of the cabin, and some people took a blanket and held it whenever somebody wanted a little privacy.
And was there any light during the day that filtered into the car?
Well, we did have one little window.
Aside from that window?
No, that was it. This was a cattle train. This was not a person for people to. It was not a luxury train.
So it had the car had slats in the side, and that was how whatever light and air entered aside from that window?
Right.
So you said this trip took 7 days approximately.
Yeah, that's what I was told, that it took a week to get to where we were going.
Okay, and where did you arrive?
We arrived in a place called Krasnoporsk in Siberia.
Could you spell that, please?
Krasnoborsk. You want me to spell
was this
Siberia?
Town? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Did you want me to spell Siberia?
No, that's not necessary.
Okay.
Do you know how large a town or city that was?
We did not stay there. The train stopped. We got off and we were marched to our destination, which was a labor camp. It was right next to a river. And I didn't write the river's name. But there were boats, and the boat would take our belongings. However, the people had to walk to the campsite. Now, I was offered a ride because I was a child, but my parents would not separate from me. So I was being carried most of the way. From what I understand, it was a wilderness. We had a river on one side and the forest on the other side, and a little path between the two. And it took 10 hours to get to our labor camp.
You remember what the weather was like during that 10-hour march?
It was cold. Siberia has 9 months of winter, and the temperature there goes down to 40 below. So luckily, this was July. So we were there in the summer. And even the summers were not that warm. But we were lucky to come in the summer. But we did spend one winter there. And that was very, very difficult.
So you arrived at a labor camp
Yes.
After 10 hours after you were marched from the train. What camp was that?
It was called Kvasha.
I'm going to ask you to spell it, please.
Kvasha. Kvasha.
Can you describe what this labor camp was like?
Yes. There were barracks. I think there were like 4 barracks for the people to live in. There was a canteen where food was being prepared. There was a little hut called banya, where once a week the women were able to go in there and bathe and bathe. And once a week the men would go in and bathe. They had horses there. They had the stable. And not too far from there was a little, very small village where people that have been shipped there earlier lived. And they told us that we were very lucky to come here when everything was already made. The barracks were made out of boards of wood. They said when they came, there was nothing there. It was just wilderness, and they had to build everything. So we were very lucky. Now, in the barracks, we had a room that was like a 4x4, where my dad, my mother, and I lived, plus my aunt and her husband. Now, when we were in Pinsk, the 2 brothers got married and remained in Pinsk. But my aunt and her fiancé, who came with my dad earlier, got married. So there were 5 of us living in this little 4x4. There were 2 cots and a box. The box was for our belongings, and we used it for a table. If 2 people came in, the other 2 had to sit down on the cots because there was no room to stand. It was that small. Plus, I know the little cot that my mother and I and my dad slept in was against one wall, and the wall was covered with ice in the winter. So my mother put a blanket hung a blanket over the wall so that when she would lay next to it, it wouldn't be right against the ice. Of course, I got
Was there-
to sleep in the middle. And my dad,
Was
who
there-
had to get up,
Sorry. Go ahead, please.
my dad, who had to get up very early to go to work, had to sleep on the outside. So my mother was against the wall, I was in the middle, and then he on this little cot.
Was there any source of heat in this 4x4 room?
I don't remember having any.
And you said Kvassia was a forced labor camp, is that right?
That's right.
And your father was the only one of the 5 of you who had to go out and work?
Oh, no, my uncle did too, and my aunt. Now, my mother, because she had a small child, had an easy job. She would go out in the forest to pick berries and mushrooms and bring to the canteen, whereas the men had to cut down trees. They had to cut down trees because they were being used for whatever they needed. Plus, we needed firewood to cook.
Was the canteen the equivalent of the camp kitchen?
Yes. Mm-hmm. If you worked, you
Go
got
ahead.
a breakfast of porridge, and in the evening, you got a potato soup.
2 meals then during the day?
As far as I know,
Do you know
No.
how many people were in the camp?
no, I really don't know, but there were 4 barracks, and they were full. Each one was filled to capacity of Polish citizens who all were considered prisoners of war.
Who ran the camp? Was it administered by Russians?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And was it the Russian military or some other arm of the Russian government?
I really don't know. I don't know who were the people that ran it, but they certainly were Russians.
Their names, how do you spell that name?
Russians. They were definitely
Oh,
Russians. Yes.
Russians.
Now, everybody was given a heavy coat made out of cotton, real thick coat or jacket, for winter, and also felt boots because of all the snow and ice. Now, of course, they didn't have any children's clothing for me, so I had to use whatever my mother brought for me. Now, there weren't many children there. There was no school. So I don't think there were too many young people there. There were a few teenagers, but I think I was the only child, really, on the whole camp.
There were no other children there that you remember for you to spend time with?
Right, right. Now, there was a teenager in the next barrack who sometimes would come over and carry me to her place and play with me and pretend she's teacher, and we played school. But no children my age or anybody younger than teenagers.
You know the name of this teenage girl?
No, I don't even know her.
And do you remember how long you spent time with her?
No, I really don't. But I think, no, I really don't know. But I was told that she would every once in a while come and get me to play with me.
Aside from cutting down trees, what other work did your father and your aunt and her husband do?
That was it. That was the main occupation, was to cut down trees. And
that
this
for
was some.
firewood? Was it for clearing the area for more barracks? What was that done for?
That was sent down the river for people to use for building purposes,
To turn into
for
lumber?
construction.
Okay. And the nearby small town where the nearby small town, was that where one or more lumber mills were located, do you know?
No, I don't know. I don't know.
Do you know if anyone ever escaped from Kazvia?
No, it was out in the wilderness. It took 10 hours to walk there with somebody that knew the area. No, nobody ever escaped. And that's why there was the small village of people that lived there. And they had a chicken. Some of them had how do you call it? A goat. And my mother sometimes would trade one of her sweaters for an egg or a little bit of milk for me. She felt that, I should be getting a little more nutrition than potato soup. So they were more than happy to get a nice sweater, something warm than my mother had, or anything she could trade. But that was, like maybe once every couple of weeks, I would get an egg.
Was Kvassia surrounded by forest, by meadows? You said there was a river that ran past it, but the surrounding land, what was it like?
Forest, wilderness and forest.
Okay. And how long were you and your family at Kvassia?
Kvassia. We were there till, I believe, the end of August of 41. No, September. We left September 41. September of 41. We were there till September of 41.
And what happened in September of 1941?
Well, let me tell you more about the life there. My dad almost froze to death. My dad is a small person. He was always a businessman. He was not used to heavy labor like cutting down trees. And one day, two men were a little bit late to get to work. And in the dark, running through the forest, they tripped over a little bundle. And they realized it was my dad. Luckily, they carried him to that little village where they were able to put him. They had these big ovens where they baked things, and they put him on top of the oven and let him defrost. When my mother saw him, she said he was blue, and she was told not to touch any part of him, because if she touched his nose, it could fall off, or his fingers. Well, luckily, he survived. And this was the second time, really, that he cheated death. The first time was when they were shooting at him in Warsaw, and this is the second time that we were lucky those two men found him, because he was covered by snow already. I mean, they would leave 5 a.m. to go to work. So I'm very, very lucky to have had a father.
Did you ever hear your parents talk about what happened to your father?
Oh, yes. This is how I know what happened.
Did they tell you, or did you overhear them?
Well, to be honest, as I said, I blocked out most of my memory of the war. However, my daughter, one of my daughters, recorded, and I have 10 tapes of my mother's story and 4 of my father's. And I did listen to them more than once, and I heard their stories. So I know what they went through. I mean, I was a child protected by 2 parents, and I was lucky enough to have both of them. And an uncle who spent most of the time with us in the same room.
Were those 14 tapes of your parents the source of much of what you know about what happened to your family during the war?
Yes. Yes.
Did your parents, either of your parents, discuss with you after the war what they went through?
No, not really. No, but they did tell my daughter.
You know why they didn't talk with you about it?
No, no. No, we really didn't.
Did you ask them at any time after the war to tell you what had happened?
I'm sorry to say that I didn't. I was too busy with my own life.
But you said your daughter, who's one of your children,
Yes.
spoke with them?
Yes.
What did she tell you, what she had heard from your mother?
Well, she didn't. I just listened to her tapes, to all the CDs that were made. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, what happened to you and your family? Did you escape from the labor camp? Were you liberated? What happened?
Well, in July 3, 1941, Germany invaded Russia. Luckily for us, Russia changed sides and joined the Allies, and all the Polish citizens were let free. Now, we were told, you're welcome to stay here. We can use you. We need the labor, but you're free to go if you want. Of course, we want it.
And so what did you
Nobody wanted to stay. The problem was, how do we get out of there? Luckily, well, it was in August that we were let free.
August of 1941?
Yes, they said we're free to go. So the men had a meeting and they decided to build rafts and float down the river. So it took them a while to cut down trees and build rafts. And there were 22 rafts that they built. And I think there were 10 people on each raft. So I assume there were 220 people in that of Polish descent that left the camp. There were 22 rafts that left the camp. Only 9 of them reached Krasnoporsk. But we don't know what happened to the others. But we were lucky enough to be able to come down the river. I think it took a week for us to come down. Of course, at night we would stop, build a fire next to the river, since there was plenty of trees and wood. And then during the day we would get back on the rafts. But I think it took about a week to come down the river to a town, to civilization, because actually we were in the wilderness.
And what was the name of the river? Do you know?
Yes. Uftiega. Spell it.
Spell that, please.
Uftyuga. I knew you were going to ask me.
And did anyone know ahead of time where the river flowed to?
Yes, because we knew we came up walking by the river. We came from this town by the river. The train let us out by the river. So we knew it was going to go back to the town where there was a train.
Okay. Do you know how far the rafts traveled over that more than a week journey?
No, I have no idea.
Where did everyone, those who survived the journey, where did they land?
Well, we all landed the same place, in this town, Krasnoporsk, where there were some trains. From there, we could take a train and go somewhere.
And where is that town located in Siberia?
Yes, it's still up north.
What's the closest major city to that town?
I have no idea.
Okay. And so once you arrived with your family in that town, and that was your mother and father and you and your aunt and her husband, is that right?
Right.
Where did you go from there?
Well, my dad heard that there was a Polish army being formed in Uzbekistan, and it was called the Anderson Army. And that army would take the Polish citizens towards Persia and take them into Italy and have the men fight in the war. So he was hoping to join the Anderson Army. So we got on the train station, waited for a train. I don't know how long it took. There was no schedule. You just had to sit and wait till a train showed up. And if you were lucky, you were able to get into the train because there were so many people trying to get into it.
Okay, and then?
And then we spent 3 or 4 weeks on the train going down to Uzbekistan. However, when we arrived there and he tried to join the Anderson Army, he was told that even though he's a Polish citizen, he's Jewish. So he was not eligible to join.
Did your father tell your mother or you about that?
I'm sure he told my mother.
Did he tell you? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
So then being turned down by the Anderson Army, what did you and your parents do then?
Well, we ended up living there for about 3.5 years in Uzbekistan. We rented a room. We went from a very cold country to very south. Took 3 or 4 weeks to get down there by train. So this was in Asia, a very hot country. The houses were made out of mud, and there was a courtyard, and off the courtyard there was a little area that was a room that we were able to rent from an Uzbek, and he lived in the next courtyard. He lived with his family. And we were there 3.5 years.
Were there other children there?
Yes.
When you and your family lived there?
Yes. For the first time, I had a friend. The landlord had a daughter. She was close to my age. I think she was maybe a couple years older than me. And before we knew it, we became friends. And she learned how to speak Polish, and I learned how to speak Uzbek. And also, there was a Polish community, so they had a school. And I remember going to the school. I don't remember learning anything, but it was a one-room school. I was the youngest of the children. And we had one teacher for everybody. I think most of the kids were much older than me. So I did get to go to school, and I had a friend, and things were much, much improved from Siberia.
Can you still speak Uzbek?
Oh, no. I had 6 languages when I came here.
What were those languages?
And I lost them all.
What were those languages you could speak when you arrived in the United States?
Well, I don't know how well I spoke any of them, but I spoke Polish, Russian, Yiddish, Uzbek, German, and Hebrew.
And what was the last?
Hebrew,
Okay.
which I learned in Germany. And English was my 7th language. And I don't know any of them very well. Some of them I don't remember at all.
Okay. So you and your family traveled from Siberia west in
No, east,
1945, is that right?
south. We went south to Uzbekistan.
Right. Once you were there, I'm saying, you stayed there for approximately 3 years, you said.
Till the end of the war, 3.5 years. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then at the end of the war, that would be what, May of 1945?
Yeah.
Where did you and your family go from there?
We tried to get back to Poland.
And what happened?
Well, we made it back with a lot of difficulty. And when we got there, we found nobody. Nobody was left.
And back to Poland, meaning back to Lodge?
I think we should take a break.
Okay, let's do so. 5-minute break, 10-minute break, how long do you need?
Just a few minutes.
Okay. Hello again, Jeanette.
Hi.
So you and your family went from Uzbekistan to Lodge. Do you know how long that took?
No, I really don't. But before we get there, let me tell you about the life in Uzbekistan.
Please.
I didn't tell you much about it. First of all, we heard rumors what was going on in Poland about the concentration camps, about all the problems that Jews had in Europe. Now, my parents talked about it in Yiddish. This is where I learned Yiddish. They didn't realize I was listening. I was a child of 7, 8, even 6. No, by 6 we didn't hear anything yet, but I was 7 or 8 when we heard what was going on. And it just scared me to death. It just terrible, terrible things that people were talking about. Now, the life for me over there wasn't so bad. However, for my parents, that was a different story. To get food, you had to work. You had to get a ration card to get some food. So my dad became a night watchman, and the ration card allowed you to stand in line for hours to get some bread or some food that you get. And he realized that that's not going to keep us alive. So he became a smuggler. He would take tea, which was quite the thing over there, and take a train to Tashkent, sell it and at a good price, and come back with rice or other food that we could use. Now, this was fine till the Russian police got a hold of it. At one time, he was thrown in jail. This was in Tashkent. And luckily, he was able to bribe the guard to let him out. Once he came home, they knew that he was a smuggling. Everything there in Russia you could get on the black market. And he was not the only smuggler. Everybody was a smuggler. And they would be after him. I remember once we heard they were coming to look for him, and my mother quickly threw me into bed and had my dad hide under the covers with me. And when they came to the door, my mother said, "Oh, my child is very sick with typhus." Well, when they heard that, they didn't go in to check. And that's how my dad didn't get caught that time. But it was not an easy time for them. They had a terrible time. Now I'm recording this story not only for me. It's not only my story. It's my parents' story. And even though I was a child and I didn't have it so bad, being with both parents the whole time, they had a very, very rough time. both in Siberia and in Uzbekistan. I really don't know how long it took us to get back to Poland, but I'm sure it took quite a while because the trains didn't have a regular schedule. We had to wait for one train, get off, and wait for another train. And I really don't know how long it took.
Okay. You said you and your family heard terrible things about what was happening in Poland.
Yes.
What did you hear?
Well, we heard about the concentration camps, about people being murdered all the time.
Who did you hear this from?
I don't know how those rumors came back, but somehow they got back to us.
Do you remember how you responded?
Well,
How you felt when you heard these things?
I was very scared, very scared. It was just too much for a 7, 8-year-old to hear.
Mm-hmm. And then when you and your family arrived back in Lodz, you said when you arrived back, there was nobody there. Is that right?
That's right.
There were
Nobody was left. Nobody from the family. My mother had a huge family. Nobody was left from the family. They had, her grandfather had a building, a big building, where most of the family lived in. That building became a parking lot, so there wasn't even the building there, and nobody was left. Now, my dad heard that one of his sisters survived, and she was in Italy. And my dad found an uncle who he was in contact with. But my mother didn't find anybody. She was so depressed and in such a bad state that she said she didn't even want to live. And people tried to encourage her and tell her, wow, you survived with your husband and a child. How can you say you don't want to live? But she was so depressed. And one day she said she was walking down the street and she looked up and there was this building with stained all over. And she asked people, what are those stains? And they told her, well, these are the brains of your Jewish children, because the Germans didn't bother killing them. They just took them and threw them against the wall. And this is the brains of your Jewish children. My mother came back, and after she heard that, she said, she's not staying. She cannot stay in Poland another minute. So we were there only maybe 2 months. And this uncle that my dad ran into or met, there was a Jewish organization that was looking for people to see if they could connect families. And that's how he found his uncle. And the uncle said that he had a son who was in Germany on the American side. And he suggested that we all go there. So that's when we decided to go to Germany.
Did your mother say anything more about where that wall was located, where the remains of those Jewish children were found?
On a main street.
A main street in Lodz?
Yep.
She didn't say anything more about it than that?
No.
Okay. The aunt that you said your dad learned was in Italy, did he ever reunite with her?
Oh, many years later, because she ended up going to Israel and we came to the United States. She
Do you
never
know
came
the
to
name?
Germany. She
Oh, go
went
ahead.
from Italy to the Israel.
Do you know when that was?
When?
When they met in Israel?
Oh, we didn't meet her in Israel.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
No, no. He never met her till many years later when she came to visit us.
Oh, I see. And when was that approximately?
Oh, I don't remember, but she ended up living here for a while.
Do you know the names of your mother's family members who didn't survive the war?
Oh, my goodness. I know her brothers and sister, but she had so many aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. I really don't know their names.
Do you know any of their names?
No, not really.
What about your father's family? Your dad's
My
family? Do you know
father's
the names?
family, his mother and her mother, who was an invalid, she was being taken care of by his mother because she lost a leg. So his grandmother, his mother, and his younger sister, his beautiful young sister, were taken to a meadow with all the rest of the Jews in Sampolno and burned alive. That's what we heard. And there's a monument there. That's what we heard. That's what we have. That's what
You know
he
when that,
had about his family.
have you been to see that monument?
No, he never wanted to go back. He would not go back to Poland.
And that was true for both your mother and your father?
Pardon? How?
Was that true for both your mother and your father?
No. After my father passed away, this was in what is my cheat sheet? 1999 he passed away. So this was like this was 2002, I think. My mother wanted to go back. She wanted to see her mother's grave. Her mother died when my mother was a teenager. And my mother said she knew where that grave was. I was named after her. And she wanted to go back and see her mother's grave. So me, my brother, and my daughter, and my mother went to Poland. We rented a car with a driver, and we went to the cemetery. And it took 2 days, but she did find her grave.
So her tombstone was left in place?
Pardon?
Her tombstone was still in place then?
Well, it was a little in bad shape, but it was there. Yes.
Was that the only time you returned to Lodge after World War II?
Yes.
Do you have any desire to go back again?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Okay. So let's go back then to your family arrived back in Lodge. Your mother said after seeing what she did not want to stay. From there, did you and your family go to Landsberg in Germany?
Yes.
When was that?
Oh, gee. Well, that was in 45, 46.
Do you know how you and your family got to Landsberg?
Oh, well, my dad said we had to cross quite a few borders again illegally because Germany was divided between, it was the Russian side, the English side, the American side, I think the French side. So we did have to cross some borders illegally, which somehow he managed. He's quite a conniver. And we were able to get into the United States side that was run by UNRWA, by United States.
And so in Landsberg, were you and your family assigned to go to a certain displaced persons camp?
We went to the one where my uncle said he had a son, which was Landsberg. So that's where we ended up.
Do you remember the name of that camp or where in Landsberg it was located?
Where is, I had a cheat sheet here, and I don't know what I did with it when I ran off. Could we take a minute?
Sure.
Can I take a minute to find it?
Okay.
What was the name of the camp, Jen?
It was just Landsberg am Lech. It
How do
was,
you spell Amlech?
how to spell it? Landsberg? Lansberg.
And the second word?
Landsberg am Lech. Lech is L-E-H. Lech. Yeah.
Okay. And how is it that you were granted entry to this camp? Did your parents have to apply? Did an agency direct them or provide them with access? How did that happen?
I really don't know. But it was run by the Americans, and there were people from Palestine who were trying to get people ready to go to Israel. Well, at that time it was still Palestine. But they had schools, and I went to a real school for the first time. That's where I learned Hebrew. For the first time, I really had a few friends. And when we first got there, we had to find a room, and we ended up with one room with 5 families in it. But soon we were able to find a room for ourselves. This was located in an army camp. It used to be a German army camp that they took over and made it into a displaced person camp.
Did you know when you were there that displaced persons camp was a former German military camp?
Yes, we knew that the buildings were used for soldiers before we were there.
You remember how it felt to be in what used to be a German army camp?
No, I really didn't have any strong feelings about that. I was just glad to be in a place where we had food, I had friends, I had a school, I was learning things. First time when I was 10, I had a birthday party. And soon I got a brother. And that was the most wonderful thing. I was always the only one and always so lonely. And I always dreamed of having a sibling or somebody, because I was always the only child among adults. Till then, my whole life, I was the only child among adults. And I was always very lonely. So when I got my brother, I was the happiest sister in the world.
And your brother's name?
It's Irving Auerbach.
And he was born in this displaced persons camp, you said?
Yes, he was born.
When was he born? I'm sorry.
He was born in 1947.
Could it have been October 22nd, 1948?
Well, I made a mistake. It was 47.
Oh, okay. And you described yourself as being very happy that you finally had a sibling. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Did that feeling ever go away?
My what? I'm sorry.
Did things ever change between you and your brother Irving, or were you always close, brother and sister?
Well, for a while there, he used to complain. He said, I don't have a sister, I have two mothers, because I was the one that I was the first one to give him a bath, because my mother was afraid to handle such a little baby. Whereas I had dolls by then, so I wasn't afraid. I was the one that taught him how to drink from a cup instead of a bottle. And after a while, when he became a little toddler, he said, I don't have a sister, I have two mothers. But
And when
we're
you
very
heard that, how did you
close.
feel?
But we were very close. We still are.
Can you describe how else life was like in Landsberg? You said you went to school. You said you had a number of friends for the first time, aside from the one friend you had in Siberia. What was life like in addition to those things?
Well, finally, when we got a room of our own, and my mother was able to, with a little hot plate, she was able to cook meals, and we were able to get food. And I really enjoyed life there, because not only did I have a school, I also started taking dance lessons. I took ballet and tap, and I was in performances. Our school had Hanukkah parties. We had Purim parties, and things became very normal, almost. So it was a much, much better life than I've had till then.
Were there any times when the people in Landsberg ate together as a community?
Ate together?
Mm-hmm.
No, not really. No.
But there were community events such as Hanukkah parties and Purim parties and others?
Well, that was run by the school and by the mostly by people from Palestine. They were
Did
there.
you see the Americans who were involved in administration of the camp? Did you see them at any time?
Oh, no, I don't think I did. I'm sure my
Did you ever
parents ran into them in different offices and different papers they had to sign, but no, I didn't.
Was it the American military, American Army, who ran the camp?
No, it was UNRWA. I don't know what it stands for. United something.
United Nations Relief Agency?
Right, something like that. Right. They ran it. And then I think the Jewish family was involved. And at least they were involved when we came over here.
So do you have fond memories of being in Lawrenceburg?
Yes. Yes, I do.
Were they memories the first time you had happy memories
Yes.
of being somewhere?
Yes.
So how did that feel for you? Do you remember?
Well, I was a very happy child at that time. Yes.
Did you feel relieved at any time?
Oh, yes. See, I didn't have the problems that my mother had. She lost her whole family. To me, I really didn't know the family. I was 3 when I left Poland, so I was never really that involved or that, you know what I mean? And I certainly didn't remember anybody from then. So
At that time, did you know about what happened to the Jews in Europe?
oh, yes.
What
Yes.
did you know?
When?
No, what did you know?
Oh, I knew about the concentration camps, about the ovens. I knew about my grandmother and her mother being burned alive. I knew that.
Do you remember how you learned about these things?
No, I don't remember that.
Okay. So how long did you and your family live in Lawrenceburg?
We were there till 49. We left Lawrenceburg in April, May. The end of May, we left Lawrenceburg on General Holbrook, a ship that went to Boston. We arrived in Boston on June 6th.
And how did you get to Boston?
By ship.
Okay, a ship across the Atlantic?
Right. General Holbrook. It was a army ship, big army ship.
And was everyone from Lawrenceburg on the ship going to Boston? Did some go to what became Israel?
Oh, yes.
What happened?
Not everybody from Lawrenceburg went on that ship. There were people from other DP camps also. No, not everybody. A lot of people decided to go to Israel. In fact, I was packed. At the age of 10, I was packed and ready to go. But my parents wouldn't allow it. But I would have ended up on the Exodus probably. But I was all for it. I wanted to go to Israel. But my dad heard from his sister. His sister was in Israel by then. And somehow he heard from her that life in Israel, in Palestine, was very difficult. And if he can, he should go to the United States. So he signed up on the quota system.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
He signed up on the quota system to come to the United States.
And do you know if your parents had to be sponsored to emigrate to the United States?
No, nobody sponsored us. We didn't have any family here. So nobody sponsored us. It was just on the quota system that we came.
And so when did you arrive in Boston?
On May 6th, 1949.
And so you had just turned 13?
Yes.
And your brother Irving was almost
A year and a half.
a year old? A half year old?
Year and a half, yes.
Okay. So when you arrived in Boston, what happened?
Well, the Jewish family treated us very nicely. They picked us up in a car, and they took us to a train station and said that we were assigned to go to Cleveland. So many people went here, so many people went there. We were assigned to go to Cleveland. So we went to Cleveland.
And was that assignment done by the Joint Distribution Committee?
Or probably, or the Jewish family. I don't know who decided that.
Okay. And so when did you arrive in Cleveland?
When?
Yes.
The next day or 2 days later.
How did you travel to Cleveland?
By train.
And so when you and your family arrived in Cleveland, and by the way, that is your mother and father and you and your brother.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
Anyone else in your family?
No, my aunt and uncle, who also were in Landsberg, he had a family in San Francisco. So they sponsored them. So they went to San Francisco at a different time than we did.
Okay. And what about your aunt?
That was my aunt and uncle that was with us in Russia. They ended up going to San Francisco because he had family that sponsored him.
Okay, and that aunt and uncle, that was your mother's sister and
Yes.
her husband?
Right.
Okay. What about your mother's two brothers? Where did they
Well,
go?
they stayed in Pinsk, and we never heard from them again. The Germans came to Pinsk. They took care of them.
Okay. So when you arrived then in Cleveland, it was just the four of you.
Yes.
So what happened?
Well,
the four of you, tell us what happened when you arrived. Who greeted you?
the Jewish Family Service picked us up with a car. They took us to a shelter home where we stayed for a while. We tried to get rooms somewhere, but nobody wanted to rent rooms to people that had a child. We had a small child, so they wouldn't rent rooms for us. And they found a job for my dad. And I went to school to learn English. And every night I came home and cried that I'll never, never learn English. It just wouldn't. I couldn't catch on. I was so confused with all those languages that I had an awful time learning English. But eventually I managed.
So what happened then?
Well,
after you were in this rooming house.
Yeah. Down the street was a nursing home, a Jewish nursing home. And my dad went over there and talked to the rabbi in charge. And the rabbi said there was a little house standing empty right next that belonged to the nursing home, and it was empty. So my dad asked him if he could rent it, and we moved into that little house. We took the upstairs, and another DP family took the downstairs. And I think they had 4 children. So we were able to find a place to live. And after a while, I did manage to learn some English, and I was put into a junior high school where they would advance me. Every half a year, I would skip to the next class. And when I got to high school, I was able to, they kept pushing me ahead anyway, so I was able to graduate at I was already 19, I think, when I graduated. And that was already...
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. You were how old?
I was already 19 when I graduated in 54. 54, no, yeah. No, I was 18. I was still 18. I graduated in 1954.
And then?
Well, I found a job that I hated. And after a while, I decided I can't do this. And I decided to go. And I packed up a suitcase and went to Columbus and got admitted to Ohio State.
Got admitted to, say that again, please?
Ohio State University.
Okay. And what, did you pursue a major?
Yes. I got my Bachelor of Nursing. In 59, I graduated with a Bachelor's in Nursing.
Okay, and you were then 23?
Right.
Okay. And then what?
Well, then I spent one summer working at a summer camp as a nurse. And then when camp was over, I came home and joined Mount Sinai Hospital, where I spent 20 years working at. Not all at one time.
State University. Sorry, go ahead.
Not all at one time. I took a break when I had the kids.
I understand. We will get to that. When you finished your studies at Ohio State University and received your degree in nursing, how did you feel at that time about being in the United States? Did you feel comfortable?
I felt wonderful.
Uneasy?
I felt wonderful that I was able to manage to get that far.
Did you feel grateful?
Yes, very.
So, did you get married?
Yes, I got married in 1961.
Okay, and what is your husband's name?
Frank Buchwald.
And how did you two meet?
Well, actually, it was a blind date. I had a good friend in Cleveland, and he was living in Akron, where he had a good friend who was married to a girl from Cleveland. And that girl and my friend were classmates. So she told my friend that she had this young man that was looking for dates. for looking for a Jewish girl. He was in Akron. And he called me, and we went out. We went out to dinner. And from then on, we kept dating.
And at that time, were you living in Cleveland or Columbus or somewhere else?
No, I was living at home in Cleveland. I was living at
Okay.
home with my parents and working
how
at
long-
Mount Sinai Hospital in Cleveland.
And how long did you and Frank date?
Well, we met in the summer. It was summer or spring. And we got engaged in New Year's. And then we got married in May.
That's May of 1955?
No, May of 61.
61.
61. Mm-hmm.
And Frank's family, where were they from?
From Hungary. But he was born here. He was born here,
And-
but his parents were from, his mother was from Hungary and his father was from Czechoslovakia.
And did they emigrate to the United States before the war or
Oh,
after
yes.
the war?
Before the war. They were here before the war. They met here before the war.
And did his parents know what happened to each of their families in Hungary and Czechoslovakia?
Well, his father passed away when he was a baby. And his mother was lucky enough to have 4 of her sisters here and a brother. So they were all here already. Now, I don't know if she had any other family. We never spoke about her other family that was left. But all her sisters and the one brother were here. I guess they came at the same time, before the war. So she was very
And
lucky.
Was Frank's mother close to her siblings?
I really don't know. I knew her only a very short time because she passed away soon after we
sorry.
got married. But his father passed away when he was just a year and a half.
So you and Frank married, and you said in 1961.
Right.
And do you have any children?
3.
Can you tell us their names?
I have Rena, who lives in Israel. I have Mia, that lives here, luckily for me. And I have Seth, a son that lives near Seattle on the West Coast.
And Rena, who now lives in Israel,
Yes.
when was she born?
She was born in September of 62.
And Mia, when was she born?
She was born in January of 56.
And Seth?
Seth was born 2 years later in February of 58.
And how would you describe your relationship with your children?
I think we're pretty close. I hope we are pretty close.
Have you talked with any of them about your and your family's wartime experiences?
Oh, not really. No.
Why not?
Well, since Mia, my middle child, recorded my parents, I think they all listened to their stories. So I don't think I talk too much with them about
Have any
it.
of the 3 of them asked you questions about what your life was like in Europe?
No, they never did.
Are you open to discussing that with any of them?
I would be, sure. But I don't think,
Would you want them to be able to view this interview of you?
oh, I certainly am going to show it to them. Well, they did view, I talked to students at Hillel. That was the first time I started telling my story about 2 years ago. And they all heard it because my daughter taped it. It was on during COVID, so it was on Zoom that I spoke to the Hillel students. And Mia, who lives here, taped it. And both my son and I think my daughter in Israel saw it. So they did hear my story.
Beginning from the time you arrived in Boston, have you experienced any anti-Semitism in the United States?
Personally, no, I haven't.
Never when you were at Ohio State University?
No,
Never during your career as a registered nurse?
no. It was a Jewish hospital that I was working at. And no, none of my coworkers ever gave me any indication that they, no.
Have you ever thought about what your life would have been like if the show never happened?
No, I really didn't. But I'm sure it would have been very, very different.
And it's a hypothetical question, and I know that. I was just curious if you ever thought about what things would have been like if it never happened.
Never did.
We can let it ring a couple more times.
Say again, Ben?
The phone is ringing, but we can let it go and keep going here. Just pause 1 second until it goes to the answering machine.
Okay, I didn't hear it, so okay.
I thought I took the phones and it didn't help.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead and continue.
Okay, thank you. Going through the Shoah, Jeanette, how did it affect you?
How did that affect me?
Yes.
Oh, gee. I'm a very nervous person. And very, very fearful of things. I'll always think something bad is going to happen. Even when things are going well. And I think that has a lot to do with what I went through.
Does anything help you not feel anxious that way?
Exercise. I do a lot of exercise, a lot of physical therapy. At my age, I have to keep going. I do ballroom dancing.
Which you learned soon after you arrived in the displaced persons camp.
Pardon? Oh, yes, I took ballet. As a 10-year-old, I took ballet and tap dancing, yes.
When you and your parents traveled from Landsberg to Boston, did you see how that emigration affected them?
Oh, my. Me and my father were sick for the whole week we were on the boat. We were in very bad shape. I had no idea how it affected them.
Sick from seasickness?
Yes. Yes. Terrible.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Terrible.
But once you got off of that ship, and your parents and you traveled from Boston to Cleveland, what did your parents go through at that time? Did you see them change?
Well, I think they were very relieved and apprehensive about this new life, I'm sure. Everything was new to them. They didn't know English. They didn't learn English. So it was very difficult for them.
And once you and your family were settled in Cleveland, what was your family life like?
Well, I was busy with school. My mother was busy raising a child, and my dad was working. So we were all busy, and I think much happier than we have been. I'm sure they've been much happier than they've been. First of all, they had a nice place to live. I mean, we wouldn't consider it nice right now, but at that time, from where we came, it was a nice, at least we had 2 bedrooms. I didn't have to sleep with my parents in the same bed. I could sleep in the next room. So that was quite a change.
Did they tell you what their aspirations were once they started living in the United States?
No, they never did. My dad always was looking out for us, making sure we had all the comforts that he could provide. And after a while, my mother went to work once my brother got into school. And she learned.
What did she
do?
What did she do?
She was selling hats at May Company, a big store downtown. And after a while, my dad was able to manage a store of his own, of clothing store. And then she quit her job and was helping him in the store.
And they worked well together, do you know?
Yes, they worked pretty well together. And then they bought a house. And things were looking up. Yeah.
Have you been active in your community now, giving presentations about the Shoah, about anything else?
Well, mostly about the Shoah.
Tell us, please, about those activities.
Well, I belong to this face-to-face, where twice a week we bring in students from all over Ohio and around Cleveland, and we teach them about the Holocaust. Now, sometimes I'm a speaker and tell them my story. Sometimes I'm just a docent in a little museum that we set up and talk to them about the Holocaust.
Who are the members of Face to Face?
Who are members? Well, it's run by an organization called Israel. Call Israel was founded by displaced persons that came from Europe, like us. And they formed this organization, and now it's run by second and third generation, actually, because most of the actual survivors are gone. I'm one of few that remain, because most of them were older and they're gone. But Kol Israel is still going strong, and it's run by second and third generation. And they have this organization, and they do the face-to-face, where they educate children, and it's located in one of the big synagogues that we have in Cleveland.
And about how many members are there of Kol Yisrael?
I really don't know. Couldn't tell you.
How does it feel to be working with second and third generation members?
It feels good. I'm glad. I'm glad they're interested, and I'm glad they're active, and I'm glad they're doing something to continue this and help
and when
children.
You give your I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And help children to learn about hate and what was going on in Europe during the German war.
When you give your presentations as part of Face-to-Face, what do you talk about?
I just tell them about our suffering and what we went through, even though my story is different than a lot of other Holocaust survivors, because I was not in a ghetto, I was not in concentration camps. Still, I was a displaced person.
Have you formed any friendships being part of Kol Yisrael? Or are they more working relationships?
Just working relationships, no. Most of my friends are gone, I'm afraid.
How have the events of Hamas's attacks on Israel on October 7th of 2023 and after, how have those affected you?
Very, very upsetting. Very upsetting to me.
What is upsetting about them?
About how many Jews and how they were murdered. It's just unbelievable that we went through another Holocaust.
Have you been fearful of that?
Yes, very.
Do you see your efforts in Face-to-Face part of an educational effort to try to reverse the public's perception of Israel?
I hope so. I hope so. I hope it's making it has some effect on some of the kids.
You ever go to schools or universities to present your story?
No, except for Hillel that I did on Zoom. I haven't been to universities. I have been to Jewish schools. I have been to a couple times. I spoke at a Jewish school. And wow, what a difference. The children were so much more appreciative. And they send me emails thanking me for my speech. And what a difference talking to Jewish kids and non-Jewish kids.
Jeanette, do you sometimes pinch yourself and find yourself amazed that after everything you've been through, here you are educating people about the Shoah at your young age?
At my young age?
Mm-hmm.
My old age? Yes, especially since I would not speak. I always felt that I had an accent and I never wanted to speak in front of people. I was very bashful. I don't know. I shocked everybody when I started speaking. I really surprised my family when I told them that I'm starting to speak to about the Holocaust.
How did they respond?
They're very happy that I'm doing it.
Hmm. Did
Yeah.
any of your children, and you have grandchildren, by the way, do you not?
Yes, 6.
How many 6
6.
grandchildren?
Yes.
Do you have any great grandchildren yet?
No.
Not yet.
No. But I have a grandson getting married at the end of next year.
Hmm. So there's hope.
Yeah, right.
Why are you doing this interview?
Pardon? Why?
Why are you doing this interview?
I'm doing it for my parents. I don't think my parents had a chance to really talk about their, everybody that came from the ghettos and from the concentration camps, they were the ones, they were the survivors. We, coming from Russia, were not considered survivors. I don't know. And I don't think my parents were treated by others the same way. So I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing it for them. Because I think they had a story and they had a lot of suffering. And that's what I want to convey, that people not only suffered when they were in Europe, but they suffered because of the war, they suffered in other places too.
You would, in some circles, be considered to be a child survivor.
Yes.
Is, that you were under the age of 18 when you went through the Shoah.
Right.
Have you ever found yourself to be discounted or minimized by other survivors because you're a child survivor?
No, but because I survived in Russia and not in Poland where I was born.
How was that discounting? How did it happen?
Well, we have a monument here at our cemetery, and it's becoming a national monument. And once a year, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have a gathering, we have speakers, we light 6 candles for the 6 million. My parents were never asked to light a candle. This past year, was the first time I was asked to light a candle. And I really felt bad for my parents that they were thought of as being different because they were not in a ghetto. They were not
because they survived in Russia.
Right.
Even though they were in effect in a ghetto in Pinsk. They were in a ghetto in Lodz. But they weren't considered to be survivors by some, you're saying?
No, we got away from Lodz before there was a ghetto. We got away before there was a ghetto.
Okay.
So we really were not in a ghetto. We were just in a labor camp in Russia.
So being discounted that way, especially that your parents were discounted that way, how have you felt about that?
Well, I felt bad for them. I really did. And that's why I decided to do this Shoah.
Okay. So I have a last question for you.
Okay.
Is there any message you have for anyone who will be watching this interview?
just remember that displaced people suffer, no matter where they've been displaced to. And war is a terrible, terrible thing, and has to be avoided at all costs. I just hope that Israel survives this war.
I lied. I had one more question related to that. What, after people watching this interview, would you want them to do?
I want them to be open-minded. I want them to be kind to each other and listen to each other. And I don't know. Just be kind to each other.
Is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, not really.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jeanette. Ben, shall we go through the photographs and drawings?
Okay, those are my parents.
And go ahead and say their names again for us.
Sam Auerbach and Sylvia Auerbach.
Great. Let me get this. Let's do that one more time. I didn't have the mic in there. Go ahead and say it one more time for me.
Sam Auerbach and Sylvia Auerbach, my parents.
And Jeanette, when was that taken? Do you know?
Oh, before the war. I don't know.
You know about how old they each were in that photo?
In their 20s.
Okay. Jeanette, can you tell us who is in these two pictures?
That's my dad's parents, his father, who was a rabbi, and his mother, Itzhak Auerbach and Rivka Auerbach.
And do you know how old they each were when these photographs were taken?
No idea.
And how did you get these photographs?
From my mother's album.
She brought them out of Europe?
Yes.
There's probably a long story about that too,
Yes.
but we don't need to cover that unless you'd like to.
No, I have no idea how she got them or when she brought them.
Okay.
All right.
Jeanette, who is in this photo?
That's me. It looks like I'm about a year old. And my uncle, Mayor Verdiger.
And was that photograph taken in Lodz?
Yes, it was taken in Lodz. Well,
And how old
actually, it looks like it must have been taken during a vacation because there is a forest in back of it. So it must have been at a resort or someplace.
And how old was your uncle when that picture was taken? Do you know?
Oh, no, I really don't know. He must have been in his early
Do you know-
20s.
Do you know who took the picture?
No, no idea.
Okay, we're
Jeanette, who is in this photo?
That's Burach Verdiger, and that's my mother's second brother, the one that carried me over the border from Poland to the Russian side.
That is from the German-occupied portion of Poland to the Russian-occupied portion?
Correct.
Okay. And that was in 1939,
Right,
sometime around October?
right.
Okay. And do you know how old Baruch was in that photo?
He must have also been in his 20s. I would think.
Do you know who took the photo?
No.
Okay.
Okay. 2, 1.
Jeanette, can you tell us who's in this photograph?
On the left is my mother. That's Sasha Auerbach. Well, at that time she was still Vertiger. And Anna is her younger sister. And they look like they're in their late teens here.
Do you know when that was taken?
No idea.
Do you know where it was taken?
No idea. Sorry.
Do you know why it was taken?
No.
Do you know who the photographer was?
No.
Was this one of the photos from your mother's album?
No, my brother had it. He gave me that. He printed that for me.
Do you know how he got it?
No.
Okay, thank you. Jeanette, who are the people in that photograph?
That's my mother's on the right. And my aunt, the one that spent all that time during the war with us in the same room, is Anna. And her name is now, and it was Anne Pomerantz. They're, of course, both passed away.
And your mother's name?
Sylvia Auerbach.
And do you know when that was taken?
That was taken, when my aunt's son was bar mitzvah. So that was quite a few years ago when we were visiting San Francisco, and they were together. So this
Was that the last time that your mother and her sister were together?
No, I don't think so. I think they've seen each other since then. But not much, not much
Okay.
more.
And about what year was that photograph taken?
Sorry, I don't remember.
Okay.
Well, you said it was your aunt's son's bar mitzvah.
I think so.
Does that help place it?
Oh, no, wait. I think it was her daughter's wedding. That's when it was. Her daughter's wedding.
Which daughter?
Oh, she only had one daughter.
What was her
My-
name?
Her name was Susie Pomerantz, and she passed away already, too.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But does that help place then the approximate year?
Well, no, that must have been quite a while ago. No, I don't remember what year that was.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are rolling.
Jeanette, who is this?
This is my aunt. This is my dad's younger sister. Oh my God, I just can't remember her name right now. This is the one that got burned alive with her mother and grandmother in Sampolno. This is his youngest sister.
What is her name?
Oh my goodness, what was her name? Yanka Auerbach.
And do you know when this was taken? She's holding a musical instrument. I can't tell if it's a lute or I can't tell what it is.
I don't know what she's holding. Ukulele? I don't know. She must have been early 20s, or maybe even younger.
And
Because she was,
that taken in Lodge?
I don't know where it was taken, but this was my dad's baby sister.
Okay.
Okay. Jeanette, can you tell us about that photograph?
That is Poland, and that was divided where the left side belonged to Germany and the right side is Russian. And Pinsk, you can see where Pinsk is, where we went from Lodz to Pinsk. Lodz is not on there, but it was very close to Warsaw.
Right, and so I'm sorry. This is a map then
Of Poland.
soon after the September 1 invasion by the Germans.
Right.
When Poland, this would have been sometime around or after September 24th of that year,
Right.
when Poland was divided between Germany and Russia. Is that right?
Right. Okay.
All right. Map. So we're rolling.
Jeanette, would you tell us, please, what this map is of?
The map is where we traveled from Pinsk. We traveled all the way to Siberia, and then from Siberia all the way down to Uzbekistan, and then back to Poland.
And what book is this map? Does this map appear in?
What book is it? It's the.
This is a book written by a young man who was in the same barrack that we lived in. However, he was 14 at the time, so he wrote this book, and about 200 pages of it is my story. He was now a doctor in England, and we were able to find his books online. And my brother ordered it for everybody in the family.
What is the book's title?
The Ice Road, written by Stefan Weidenfeld.
And are you mentioned in those 200 plus pages? Or is that just a story of what all of you went through?
We're not mentioned in this book, but my mother mentions his father, who was a doctor, and she had asked him to look at my dad when my dad was sick. So my mother mentions his family in her tapes.
And how did you find out about this book? Or how did your brother find out about this book?
Online. I don't know how he found out. But his daughter lives in Canada, and that's how he found it. This is Kwasha.
Go ahead.
I have a picture of Kwasha. I want this.
Oh, I'll show Ken.
Yeah.
Here we go, Ken.
That's the first. How is that?
That's fine.
Is this okay?
Mm-hmm. Okay, we got that. Okay.
Camp Kwasha. And the very first barrack is where we stayed, and also this young man's family stayed in the same barrack.
Could you point out which barrack that is for the camera?
It's written, our barrack, right here.
Okay.
This one is our barrack.
And that's a drawing that was drawn by the author, do you know?
I don't know if he drew it. And this is inside the barrack. I don't know if I should show you inside the barrack.
You got it.
Hmm?
Good.
Do you think we should?
Oops. Oops. So that's
I
inside
see.
the barrack.
Should we take that picture?
I've got it already.
Oh, you got it already? Oh.
Okay, I'm going to cut on that.
Is it too dark?
Nope, that's fine. Here, let me show Ken real quick. Oh, Ken, I think you might be muted.
Sorry, I see. Can you describe, Jeanette, the clothing that's in that picture and how it relates to your and your family's time there?
Well, the adults got the heavy coats and the felt boots to wear in the winter. And as you see that poor little dog, how skinny he is, that's how much food we had there.
And what clothing were you issued while you were there?
I was not. I was a child. They didn't have any children's clothes. I just had to wear whatever I had. And I didn't have any shoes, so I was carried wherever I had to go. I was
Lucky you.
4 years old. Yes.
Okay, we're
Jeanette, can you tell us about this drawing?
This is the raft that the men put together so we could float down the river to leave Kvasha. And there were usually 10 people per raft. Once in a
That's-
when we,
that's-
our raft
Okay.
our raft happened to separate during the trip, and half of us were on one side and the other half on the other side. Luckily, we both arrived together.
And there's a circle at one end of that drawing. What is that circle? I couldn't see what it is.
I really don't know what it is. I have no idea what that circle is here.
And is that a drawing? Does it say, was it a drawing by the author of The Ice Road?
That's whoever did it in the book. This is also from the book.
Thank you.
okay. 3, 2, 1.
Jeanette, tell us please who is in that photograph.
That's me in Germany with my baby brother, Irv Auerbach, and he's about 9 months old here,
We just want to leave it down there.
and I'm 13. I'm 12. No, I'm 13.
So
I'm
that was
13.
taken in Landsberg,
In Landsberg, yes.
and that was then taken in approximately 1948.
47, when he was born. Oh, 48 already, in 48. He was born at the end of 47. So this was in 48.
Okay, and
And this is my,
Jeanette, tell us please who the 4 people are in this photograph and when it was taken and why.
well, that was taken in 1959. That's my graduation from Ohio State. My mother, me, my brother, and my dad.
So your father is on the far left?
No, my father is on the right. My mother's on the left.
Oh, okay, and their names, please.
Sylvia Auerbach, Jeanette Auerbach, Irv Auerbach, and Sam Auerbach. Or at least that, at that time I was Jeanette Auerbach.
And do you know who took the photograph?
No, I really don't remember.
Is there something written on the back, maybe?
Nope, nothing.
Okay.
okay. And 1 minute.
Jeanette, this is not a test, but tell us, please, who each of the people are in this photograph.
Oh my
First
goodness.
the front row, left to right, and then the back row, left to right, as best you can.
Oh my goodness, this is my family. It was taken at Yellowstone Park for our 50th anniversary. My kids take us camping, and this is the first time I went camping in a tent. So on the bottom is Ruth Gallus, and she is the daughter of my son-in-law. Next to her is Noam Gallus, and that's my grandson, my pride and joy. Next to him is Shani Gallus, and right now she's in medical school in Case. And next to her is Orly Kessam, and she's the one that lives, my granddaughter that lives in Haifa. And next to her is her sister, Amira Kessam, who lives near Buffalo, New York, and she's an engineer. Now, the top is Dan, and he is now married to Ruth.
What's his full name, please?
Pardon?
What's his full name, please?
I don't remember.
I said it's not a test.
Next to him is Mia Buchwald Gallus, and she's my daughter that lives here, and she runs an organization for autism. She has 20 people working in that organization. Next to her is her husband, Joe Gallus, and next to him is me, Jeanette Buchwald, and then my husband, Frank Buchwald. Next to him is my son, Seth Buchwald, and next to him is his wife, Laura Buchwald. And since that picture, they have twin daughter and son that are 8 years old. And next to her is Dani Kessam, who lives in Israel, and my daughter, Rena Kessam, who lives in Israel. And
Well, tell
that's
me,
my family.
are you proud of your family?
Very, very proud. I have a wonderful family.
Nice to hear. Very nice to hear.